we're going to shift our focus now to a little bit of the Civil War. I want to bring Abraham Lincoln into the discussion because Abraham Lincoln's awesome. Who doesn't like talking about him? But want to talk specifically about his relationship with slavery. He obviously has a reputation as being the great emancipator because he leads the war that will eventually end slavery. But we're going to go back and check out some of his some of his actions before but before he becomes that particular person. The early views that Lincoln has on slavery are different than what we think about him espousing later on in his life. I've got a word up on there, apocryphal. And basically apocryphal stories are stories that we can't really prove happened. They could be just kind of legends that that have been passed down over time, kind of like Washington chopping down the cherry tree, things like that. One of the stories told about a young Lincoln is a poor kind of laborer in his young life. He at one time took a trip to New Orleans. They had I think it was timber or something like that they cut, and then went down the Mississippi River to sell in New Orleans. And supposedly when he came to New Orleans, he was confronted for the first time with the slave market, and he saw a slave auction and was so taken aback by what he had seen that it really was an affecting experience for young Abraham Lincoln. You don't see a lot in his early political career about ending slavery. I think it's safe to say that Lincoln doesn't start out as an abolitionist. He had serious doubts as to whether American society could operate with freed black men and women living alongside free white men and women. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were these very famous debates he has with Stephen Douglas leading up to a Senate campaign, he comes off as being against slavery. He calls it a moral wrong, but really a lot of his argument against slavery was economic. He didn't believe slavery should be allowed to expand into the territories. And so the idea was, as a poor man himself, he understood the importance of people being able to have jobs. And he said, look, if we send slavery out into the territories, that's going to take jobs away from kind of the poor white laborers who will be going there. So he's almost seeing a competition in labor, kind of that old "they're taking our jobs" argument that you hear sometimes with immigration, but this time surrounding the expansion of slavery. He wanted to preserve the territories for those types of laborers. He in 1860 will be the Republican candidate for president. The Republican Party was a party built in opposition to slavery. And so his election, we've seen, will kick off the Civil War and start that conflict. Lincoln himself said this, though. He said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And that's very important. Lincoln's actions all through his presidency, all through the Civil War, were about preserving the Union. Now we're going to see that attitude changes to where he thinks that doing that eventually freeing, emancipating the slaves in the rebelling states is going to be good militarily, but again, not quite there to great emancipator status yet. Lincoln never acknowledged the Confederate States of America, never acknowledged Jefferson Davis as president of anything. He always referred to the Confederacy as the rebelling states. He didn't believe that states had a right to leave the Union. So if they didn't have a right to leave the Union, they sure as the world couldn't form their own country. And so he was always talking about the rebelling states. And so as the war kind of drags on, though, from 1861, 1862, he becomes convinced that there needs to be a refocusing. There has to be, kind of this moral argument made for why this war must be won. And so he sits down with his cabinet and reads them a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation is going to free slaves, but importantly, only in the rebelling states. And so there were 4 states that had stayed loyal to the Union but still had slavery. Lincoln was not freeing slaves there. One of them was Kentucky, right, our neighbor to the south. Didn't want Kentucky to have any reason to join the Confederacy as well. But he basically said anybody in the rebelling states that's a slave, January 1st, 1863, you're free. Now, they didn't think he was their president anyway. So this is more of a ceremonial thing. It's a refocusing, saying, okay, this is what we're fighting for. And it's also a message to slaves that we're going to hear about emancipation, that maybe you don't work as hard. Maybe you kind of, as safely as you can, actively resist what's going on in the South, because now we know if the North wins, slavery is going to be gone. As he starts to look, even towards the end of the war, he's still stuck on this idea of what's the country going to look like. And for a while, he actually looks and supports a colonization movement. Basically, the idea that we were going to buy or send slaves back to Africa. Now, what he didn't understand, and what a lot of these people don't understand, is these people are generations removed from Africa. The United States, for the men and women in slavery in the Civil War, is their home. It hasn't been a pleasant home. Obviously, they're enslaved. That's been terrible, but it's the only place that they know. Sending them back to Africa, a place where they don't know the customs, they don't know any family, they don't know the languages, wasn't really a practical solution. But like I said, something that he kind of muddied around with. Rumor comes around towards the end of the Civil War that they want to break up the plantations and then give every former slave 50 acres and a mule. Probably just a rumor. That was something that they'd hear people talking about, but never materializes. The deal with Abraham Lincoln is we really don't have any idea what he would have done with kind of bridging this gap between the slave population and then once they're freed at the end of the Civil War, because he's assassinated. Got a great movie in the film library called Lincoln that shows the push that he made for an amendment to the Constitution banning slavery. And so he becomes convinced that that's what needs to happen for the nation. But he goes to Ford's Theater to see a play right after the Civil War has ended. Lee has surrendered, and John Wilkes Booth will shoot him and assassinate President Lincoln. You see a painting here. That box that you see up top left-hand corner, the fellow's jumping out of, that's John Wilkes Booth jumping out. That was the presidential box. You ever get a chance to go to D.C., it's a really cool place to go check out. The National Park Service runs that. Booth, it was a Southern sympathizer, famous actor. Lincoln seen a play called Our American Cousin. And Booth, it was a comedy. Booth knew when the biggest laugh was going to occur. So he sneaks into the president's box, puts a small pistol behind his ear. When the laugh happens, he pulls the trigger. He jumps to the stage. He catches his spurs on one of the flags that they're in front, so he lands awkwardly, breaking his leg. As he lands, he yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, and runs off. Actually escapes Washington, D.C., and there's a huge manhunt that goes on for several days following the shooting. President Lincoln will die, though, and so he doesn't have, obviously, direct control over the way the nation is going to handle Reconstruction and what had happened. So that's kind of left for the ages. What does happen, though, is we have 3 amendments that are added to our Constitution that deal with slavery. The first is the 13th Amendment. This is adopted in 1865. This was actually a condition of the surrender, is that the former Confederate states had to approve the 13th Amendment, and this outlaws slavery everywhere in the United States. So this battle that had been raging before the United States was even a country, but definitely in those early constitutional arguments, is finally put to bed. Slavery is not going to be around anymore. The 14th Amendment, you could argue, may be the most important amendment to our Constitution. It extends the rights of citizenship to anyone who is born in the United States. This is going directly against that Dred Scott decision that we talked about. Dred Scott was born in the United States, therefore he is a citizen and is entitled to, and this is the big deal, equal protection under the law. So the law has to treat everyone the same, regardless of the color of your skin, your gender, anything like that. The law has to treat you the same. I put a piece of the 14th Amendment up here. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any laws which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. That's going to be one that's going to be really important to us second semester as we start to look at the modern civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, those guys, as they struggle for equal rights at that time. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, extends voting rights to black men. This one's controversial. We're going to talk about it a little bit when we talk about women's discrimination. But this is going to extend those voting rights to all men in the United States. Those three amendments we call the Civil Rights or the Civil War Amendments because they're passed there in the aftermath of the Civil War and really connect back to a lot of the ideas that Lincoln comes to embrace as that conflict continues.